I spent 22 years taking care of my husband, Thomas Carter. 22 years of folding his clothes, measuring his pills, scrubbing the floors of a house that never really felt like mine. I cooked his favorite gumbo, drove him to his therapy sessions, and slept in a chair through every hospital stay. People used to call me an angel, and I believed them because back then they thought love meant endurance. That morning at Lafayette General, the air smelled like antiseptic and weak coffee. The nurse's shoes squeaked across the linoleum as I carried a paper bag of biscuits and his favorite Corey coffee from the cafe downstairs. Thomas had suffered another mild stroke a week earlier, and though the doctor said he'd recover again, I'd noticed a new hardness in his eyes, a quiet cruelty that hadn't been there before. When I reached his room, the bed was empty. "He's out in the courtyard," the nurse said, smiling. "Said he needed some sunshine." I nodded, grateful he was finally out of bed, and made my way down the hallway. The courtyard was quiet, bathed in soft morning light, filtering through the oak branches. I saw him near the fountain in his wheelchair talking to another patient, a man about his age, wearing a faded veteran's cap. I slowed down, not wanting to interrupt. That was when I heard it. "Evelyn," Thomas laughed, that low, throaty laugh that once made Dame fall for him. "She's just my live-in nurse. I pay her with my patients." The words didn't register at first. My hands froze on the handles of the bag. Then he kept talking, his voice carrying across the open air. "She fusses over me like a maid. I let her. Keeps her busy. You'd be amazed what you can get for free if you act helpless enough." The man chuckled, and Thomas leaned back with a satisfied grin. "I've got it all arranged. The house, the savings, everything's going to my son, Mark. I may be half paralyzed, but I'm no fool. I take care of blood, not charity." He felt the ground tilt beneath me. The sunlight that moments ago seemed warm now felt like fire on my skin. Every breath scraped through my chest. 22 years of devotion, erased in a few sentences, said for amusement. I turned away before they saw me. My knees felt like water. I stood behind the brick wall near the door, gripping the bag until the paper tore, coffee leaking through my fingers. For a moment I thought I might scream, but the sound never came. When I finally walked back to the room, my face was calm, my smile practiced. Thomas looked up as if nothing had happened. "You're back, sweetheart. Did you get the biscuits?" "Yes," I said, setting them on the tray. My voice didn't shake. He reached for own, oblivious. That night, I sat in the empty kitchen, staring at my reflection in the window. In 22 years, I'd never kept a diary. But that evening I opened a notebook and wrote one sentence. "If love is duty, then what is betrayal?" The next morning, sunlight filtered through the blinds of our house in Lafayette. Falling across the same oak dining table I had polished for over 2 decades, every mark, every scratch told a story that wasn't mine. I moved through the kitchen on autopilot, boiling water for oatmeal, setting the tray for Thomas, even though he was still at the hospital. The silence pressed against the walls like humidity after a storm. That house had never belonged to me. Thomas bought it with his first wife, Margaret. Her photograph still hung in the hallway-framed smiles of a life I'd never lived. He refused to take them down, saying, "She was part of my history. You're part of what's left." Back then, I told myself it was romantic, that I was sharing a man's legacy. Now I saw it for what it was, a quiet eraser. When I married Thomas, I left everything behind. I sold my little house near Lake Charles, left my librarian job, and moved here to care for him and his teenage son, Mark. It told myself that love required sacrifice. I told myself that patience could build belonging, but belonging never came. Mark never called me Mom. On good days, he'd grunt a greeting before disappearing into his room. On bad days, he made sure I knew exactly what he thought of me. "You'll never replace her," he once said, pointing to his mother's picture on the mantel. "So stop trying." I didn't reply. I only made dinner and prayed that time would soften him. At church, the lady said I was a saint. "Evelyn, you have the patience of Job," they'd whisper after Sunday service. I smiled because it was easier than explaining that saints don't cry quietly in the laundry room. I learned to fold my emotions into clean towels, smooth them flat, hide the creases. After the accident that paralyzed Thomas's legs, my world became smaller. The kitchen, the hospital, the pharmacy, the endless loop of care. Each day began with his medicine schedule and ended with the sound of his mechanical bed adjusting. There were no vacations, no birthdays, no weekends, only routines, only obligation. Once years ago, I asked if we could repaint the bedroom, brighten it with a new color. He frowned and said, "This shade of blue keeps me calm." Margaret chose it. You wouldn't understand. That night, I cried quietly in the bathroom, staring at the peeling wallpaper that smelled faintly of antiseptic and loss. Somewhere in those 22 years, I began to fade. My friends stopped calling. My daughter, Lena, from my first marriage, moved to Baton Rouge and built a life I rarely saw. She always said, "Mom, you deserve more than this." But I would just smile and tell her I was fine. Now, sitting at that same table, I realized I couldn't remember the last time anyone had asked how I was. Maybe no one ever did. Maybe I taught them not to. For 22 years, I had taken care of a man who never saw me. And somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing myself. 3 days after Thomas's latest stroke, I came home alone to handle paperwork. Hospitals in Lafayette never lacked for forms, billing statements, insurance claims, disability notes. I had a folder for everything, color-coded the way he liked it. Blue for medical, red for taxes, yellow for property. The house smelled faintly of bleach and old rain. I sat at the oak desk in the corner of the living room, sorting through envelopes that had piled up during his hospital stay. The rhythm of paper shuffling usually calmed me, but that evening, as the cicca hummed outside and the last light fell across the desk, a single unmarked envelope slipped out from between the folders. Its corner was torn, edges browned like it had been hidden for years. Across the front, in his careful handwriting, it said Personal Property Transfer Attic. Something in my stomach turned. Thomas never let me near the attic. He said it was too dusty, too steep, but I'd always suspected it held more than just old fishing rods and Christmas decorations. My hands trembled slightly as I slid the letter open. Inside was a notarized document stamped with the parish seal. The words blurred as I read them. Transfer of ownership to be executed upon death. Beneficiary Mark Carter and Angela Duval. Angela Duval. The name hit me like a dropped weight. I hadn't heard it in years. Angela was Thomas's former home nurse, the one who took care of him before I did, a woman I'd met once in passing. She died of cancer nearly 2 years ago. I stared at the date of the document again. It was signed 6 months ago. That was impossible. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to steady the racing beat. Either someone had forged that name, or they were using it for something worse. A living ghost with a legal signature. My throat tightened. I looked closer at the notary seal, a local office in Street Martin Parish. The ink looked slightly smudged, like someone had printed over a photocopy. I sat back staring at the page, every nerve in my body awake. For 22 years, I had believed I was protecting our life together, but now it looked like I'd been protecting Akon. I climbed the attic stairs for the first time in years. Each step creaked under my weight. The smell of dust and cedar filled the air. At the far end, beneath a slanted beam, sat an old steamer trunk I'd never seen before, locked, but with the latch loose enough to pry open. Inside were stacks of faded papers, yellowed photographs, and sealed envelopes. Near the bottom, under a folded blanket, I found a thin ledger bound in cracked leather. Inside were names, dates, and dollar amounts. Dozens of entries, some labeled Angela D., others M.C. account transfer. I didn't need to guess what they meant. My hands shook as I snapped photos of each page with my phone, one by one, my breath quick and shallow. When I climbed back down, the house felt colder, heavier, like it knew what I had just discovered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thomas had always told me I was his anchor, but now I saw it clearly. I wasn't his anchor. I was his cover. By the time Thomas returned from the hospital, the Louisiana heat had grown heavy and unmoving, thick enough to cling to the windows. I cooked only out of habit that evening. Red beans, rice, cornbread, but my hands worked without feeling. The attic document stayed hidden inside my purse, zipped under the chair cushion in the dining room. Every sound in the house seemed louder than it should be. The tick of the old clock, the slow whir of the ceiling fan, the clink of cutlery against porcelain. Around 6, I heard tires crunching in the driveway. Mark's voice followed a second later, loud, confident, entitled. "Evening, Evelyn," he called as he walked in, tossing his keys on the counter. "Dad said you'd have dinner ready." I forced a polite smile. "It's on the table." Hes slid into a seat, scrolling through his phone. "I've been meaning to talk to you," he said between bites. "About finances. Dad's not in good shape. And someone needs to handle things before it all becomes a mess." I set down the spoon. "Things, you know, accounts, property, insurance." He looked up, smirking. "You don't have to worry about any of that. I've got a lawyer friend in Baton Rouge. He'll handle everything. You'll get what you need." His words dripped with condescension. "And what exactly do you think I need, Mark?" He leaned back, crossing his arms. "A small allowance, maybe a place in a care facility later. Dad said he wants to make sure you're comfortable." Thomas nodded slowly, as if it were all reasonable. "You'll be fine, Evelyn. You've always managed." That was the moment something inside me went quiet. Not from shock, but from recognition. The same calm that settles right before a thunderstorm. Met Thomas's eyes. "You don't need to worry about me. I'll make sure everything's taken care of." He smiled, misreading my tone. "That's my girl." After dinner, I cleared the plates. When I came back, the two of them were whispering near the hallway. Their voices low but urgent. I caught fragments, documents, attic, copy. My heart began to pound. When they left for the evening, I locked the front door and walked toward the staircase. The air upstairs was still, the smell of dust stronger than ever. Then I noticed it, the faint glow slipping from under the attic door. The light was on. I climbed the stairs slowly, pulse thrumming in my ears. The trunk I'd opened was shifted. The lid cracked. Inside, papers were gone. Only the blanket remained. Someone had been here. I stood there for a long time, breathing through the fear, the anger, the disbelief. Downstairs, thunder rolled across the bayou. For 22 years, I'd lived in silence. But that night, I understood something new. Silence is not peace. It's permission. The next morning, I woke before dawn. The air in Lafayette was still thick with the memory of last night's storm. Branches dripped outside the kitchen window, and the smell of wet earth filled the house. I sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold, staring at the ceiling. The attic light had been off when I checked again at midnight, but the trunk's contents were gone. Whoever took them, Mark or Thomas, knew exactly what they were doing. I couldn't confront them without proof. Not yet, but I knew where to start. At 9 sharp, I drove across town to the outskirts of Youngsville, where my old friend Ruth Landry lived. Ruth was a retired county clerk who once managed parish property filings. If anyone could tell me whether that forged document meant something real, it was her. She opened the door in her floral robe, eyebrows rising when she saw me. "Evelyn Carter, Lord, I thought you dropped off the map." "Maybe I did," I said, holding out the envelope. "But I need your eyes on this." Ruth spread the papers across her kitchen counter, adjusting her glasses. As she read, her expression changed from confusion to anger. "This isn't official," she said flatly. "The seal's a copy and this notary doesn't exist anymore. She passed away in 2018, so it's forged. Worse, it's staged. Whoever made this wanted it to look official enough to move assets quietly." She tapped her finger on the line that read Beneficiary Angela Duval. "This name here, it's a ghost. They could be using it to funnel property through false identity filings. Whoever's behind it knows exactly what they're doing." He exhaled shakily, relief and terror intertwining. "Ruth, can you help me?" She looked up. "I can introduce you to someone. A lawyer, Claire DuPont. Sharp as a razor and hates bullies." By afternoon, I was sitting in Claire's office, a converted Victorian house that smelled of cedar and coffee. Claire was in her 40s, direct but kind. After he told her everything, she nodded slowly. "We'll start by revoking any existing powers of attorney and freezing your husband's account activity. If someone's transferring property behind your back, they'll panic when they can't access it. Will they know it's me?" "They'll know," Claire said, closing the folder. "But by the time they realize, you'll already be protected." For the first time in years, I felt something like control return to my chest. That night, I came home to find Thomas sitting in his recliner, the glow from the television washing over his face. He didn't look up when I entered. "Doctor said, I'm doing better," he muttered. "Mark will handle the hospital bills." "I'm sure he will," I said softly. Later, as rain tapped against the windows, I walked past the attic door. The bulb inside flickered once, then went dark. It wasn't fear I felt anymore. It was clarity. They thought I was still asleep inside this life. They had no idea I'd already started to wake up. 3 days later, I sat in Claire's office again, watching her type a motion to freeze all property transfers under Thomas Carter's name. Her fingers moved fast. Precise, the way I used to shelf books in the library. Methodical. Quiet, unstoppable. "Once the court stamps this," she said, sliding a document across the desk for me to sign. "No assets can move without your consent. If there's fraud, they'll trap themselves the moment they try." When he left her office, the sky over Lafayette was low and gray. The wind carried that strange heaviness Louisiana gets before another storm. I drove straight to the hospital. Thomas was sitting up in bed, propped on pillows, flipping through a hunting magazine. When he saw me, his lips curled into a faint smirk. "Heard you've been running around with lawyers," he said without looking up. "I needed advice," I replied evenly. "After all, it seems everyone's been making plans without me." He set the magazine aside, his expression tightening. "You'll ruin Mark's future with this paranoia." I folded my arms. "Maybe it's time he earns it." The silence that followed felt like the deep stillness before lightning. His jaw clenched, but I didn't give him the satisfaction of an argument. I turned, walked out, and left him staring after me. That night, the rain came, hard sheets of water hammering the roof. I was in the kitchen drying dishes when a faint beeping sound pierced through the storm. Then the smoke alarm. I ran upstairs. The attic door hung open. Smoke drifted down the stairwell, thick and acrid. I coughed, covering my mouth with my sleeve, pushing up the steps 2 at a time. The bulb flickered weakly through the haze. The steamer trunk was half open, flames licking the edges of its wooden frame. I grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hallway and sprayed until the hissing stopped. The air filled with the smell of burned paper and melted wax. When the firefighters arrived, I stood outside in the pouring rain, shivering in my robe. The chief, a kind, older man I recognized from church, shook his head after inspecting the damage. "Small blaze. Lucky you caught it early. Looks like someone left a candle burning up there." I stared at him. There were no candles. He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "We found something else from a sealed evidence bag." He showed me a half-burned folder, its edges blackened, but the inside still legible bank statements, insurance transfers, and a list of false names. Angela Duval, Carl Edmonds, Marie Lowe, dozens of them. I felt the blood drain from my face. The pattern was clear. Now Mark had been using the identities of Thomas's former caregivers to file fraudulent claims and funnel money through shell accounts, and Thomas had either turned a blind eye or helped him. When I met with Claire the next morning, I laid the charred folder on her desk. She flipped through it slowly, her expression sharpening with every page. "This isn't just inheritance fraud," she said finally. "This is a federal crime." I exhaled, steady and certain. Then it's time they learned what real accountability looks like. 2 weeks later, the courthouse in downtown Lafayette buzzed like a beehive. Reporters lined the marble steps, their umbrellas dripping from the morning rain. The air inside was cold. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and quiets the noise in your head. I sat beside Claire at the Pliff's table, hands folded neatly in my lap. Across from us, Thomas looked pale but defiant, his wheelchair positioned close to Mark, who kept whispering into his ear as if he could control the narrative by force of will. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. Claire rose first. Her voice was calm, deliberate, every word slicing through the air like the edge of a blade. She presented the burned documents recovered from the attic, the property filings under false identities, and the financial transfers linking directly to Mark's account in Baton Rouge. Each exhibit clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trapped inside for 22 years. Mark tried to interrupt, claiming everything was a misunderstanding. "Those are old insurance payments," he shouted. Standing so fast his chair scraped the floor. "She's twisting it." The judge raised a hand. "Mr. Carter, you'll speak when spoken to." Claire motioned for the next witness, Ruth Landry. My old friend walked to the stand with the same quiet confidence she'd had since high school. Her testimony confirmed everything. The falsified parish seal, the non-existent notary, the pattern of property theft filed under deceased names. When she finished, the courtroom was so still I could hear the rain hitting the windows. Then Claire played the final recording. It was taken from Ruth's landline voicemail. Mark's voice, angry, reckless. "If she finds out, we'll lose everything. Just get rid of the papers." The judge's gaze hardened. Thomas's hands gripped his wheelchair arms, knuckles white. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter," the judge said finally, his tone grave. "The evidence presented shows intentional fraud and attempted asset concealment. Mrs. Carter, you are hereby granted ownership of the marital property, restitution in the amount of $800,000, and full financial independence." Mark's jaw dropped. Thomas's face drained of color. The gavel struck wood, a sharp echo that filled the room like thunder. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I only exhaled slow and deep, as if 22 years of holding my breath had finally come to an end. Outside, the reporters rushed forward. One of them, a young woman with a trembling microphone, asked, "Mrs. Carter, how does it feel to have one after so long?" I looked at her, the courthouse doors gleaming behind me, and answered simply, "You can't steal from someone who finally knows her worth." Thomas didn't come home that night. Word spread that he'd been taken back to the hospital for high blood pressure. Mark disappeared before the evening news could air his name. When I returned to the house, the silence was vast, almost sacred. For the first time, it didn't feel empty. It felt mine. Summer returned to Lafayette slowly that year, the kind of soft, golden summer that makes the air shimmer above the bayou and the evening smell like honeysuckle and rain. By then, months had passed since the court ruling. The scandal had faded from local headlines, and I had settled into a quiet rhythm of my own. I renovated the house one room at a time, painting the walls pale ivory, replacing the faded blue curtains Margaret had once chosen. The attic, once a place of secrets, became my sanctuary. I turned it into a small writing studio, with a desk near the window that overlooked the oak trees and the slow bend of Theriver. Every morning I brewed Cory coffee, opened my laptop, and wrote. Ruth visited often, always bringing fresh flowers from her garden. Sometimes she'd tease, "Never thought I'd see you turn an attic full of ghosts into something this peaceful." I'd laugh because it was true. The past still lingered there, but now it whispered instead of screamed. One afternoon, my daughter Lena drove down from Baton Rouge with her 2 kids. They ran barefoot through the yard while she stood beside me on the porch, looking at the magnolia I'd planted after the trial. "They're beautiful, Mom," she said softly. I smiled. "They're late bloomers, but once they open, they stay strong." We sat together for a long time, watching the children chase dragonflies in the sunlight. The breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the faint hum of cicadas, and for the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing on my chest, just calm, steady breath. That evening, as the sun dipped below the bayou, I opened my notebook and began to write my first column for Southern Women Reborn, the local magazine Ruth's niece had encouraged me to contribute to. I titled it Freedom at 61. I wrote about the quiet prisons women build when they mistake obedience for love, about how devotion without respect becomes invisible labor, and about the courage it takes to step out of someone else's story and write your own. When I finished, I looked around the room, the house that was finally mine, the scent of magnolia drifting through the window, the laughter of my grandchildren floating up from the yard, and I smiled. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about excusing the past. It was about releasing it. In the last line of my essay, I wrote, "Freedom isn't leaving someone, it's returning to yourself." That night, as the crickets sang outside and the moonlight touched the magnolia petals, I felt something rare and precious bloom quietly inside me. Peace.